and welcome to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. This week on the podcast, we're getting into the importance of coaching when it comes to elevating teams and why Doug Pederson and Herm are prime examples of it in the football world. Also, the latest news from the DC and Marvel cinematic universes, as well as some perspective on what is the real true definition of mixed martial art greatness. So let's break open that six-pack of topics and get started. Topic number one, this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So with the first couple weeks of the college football season underway, as well as the first full week of the NFL season, I wanted to touch on a topic that really has become more and more apparent to me over the last few weeks. And my co-host, Deshaun Hendricks, also bringing up an aspect of this to my attention. And that is the importance of a head coach when it comes to a football team. The value of a head coach tends to get undervalued and underplayed too often. And part of the reason it gets underplayed is because of the fact that when a team is winning, typically the players get the attention, but when the team is losing, everyone looks to the head coach. In week 2 of the college football season, I was very vehement in my pick of Arizona State beating Michigan State, which was a underdog pick. It was an upset pick, but there were a couple things that went into it, and one of them was the fact that I believe, and I still do believe, that a coach can elevate a football team. Herm Edwards has brought to Arizona State a positive mentality and an attitude adjustment that has been very necessary for a program like that. For Michigan State, who has better talent at the quarterback position, for Michigan State, who has a larger recruiting base, for Michigan State, a big-time Big Ten program, to go and lose to Arizona State after having a big lead in that game shows you the want that is in that team. And I think that want and that desire and that fight comes from their head coach. The Philadelphia Eagles are another one of those teams. The Eagles won the Super Bowl without their starting quarterback, without their starting left tackle, without their starting middle linebacker. They also did it without their primary third down running back and their best special teams player, and they still won. Now, part of that came down to the depth the organization had built into that roster, but also came down to Doug Pederson keeping the guys focused, keeping the guys motivated, and giving them that mental edge. And so many times in sports, we forget that outside of a handful of players, you're not just going to find one guy to change your entire team. In basketball, LeBron James can go to any team and turn that team into a playoff contender and turn them into a potential championship contender. In football, Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady can elevate their team, but most quarterbacks cannot do that. No matter how great some of these players are, many of them cannot elevate the players around them because they're so hyper-dependent on their teammates. In team sports, the quarterback is only as good as the wide receivers who catch the ball and the offensive linemen who block for him. So on with the defense, you can have the best pass rusher in the NFL, but if the rest of the players can't tackle on that defense, that pass rusher isn't going to do much for your poor level of talent on your team. You look at baseball, you can have the best pitcher in the game, but if your team can't score any runs, it's all for naught. Look at a guy like Jacob deGrom with the Mets. He's the best pitcher in baseball this year, but his team can't score any runs for him. He's given up one extra base hit when he gets a count to 0-2 all season long. And yet he doesn't have a good win-loss record because that win-loss record is dependent on his team scoring runs and his bullpen, when they come in, when he leaves the game, not ruining his great start that he had. So in team sports, there are so many variables that go into it that very rarely can one player elevate a team. I spoke with ESPN NFL analyst Mike Clay last weekend, and I asked him about what is it about Doug Pederson that makes him this guy who is able to elevate his team? Because to me, what makes Doug Pederson great isn't his play calling per se. It's the fact that he is so great at handling the team. He is so great at managing the players and situations. And this is what Mike Clay had to say. Just take a listen because it's a very insightful cut here from my interview over the weekend.
It's interesting. I thought a lot about that during the offseason, right? You had off-field trouble with this team. You had the suspensions with Bradham. You have the felony charge against Michael Bennett. We'll see what happens there. You have the injuries to Wentz and Jeffrey and Jernigan. And it starts piling up, and you look at this team and say, okay, they're loaded on paper, probably the best team from top to bottom in the NFL. But with all these other extenuating circumstances, with teams tending to struggle to repeat aside of New England for the Super Bowl, how do you pick them? And I kind of go back to, you know what, they can deal with some injuries. They can deal with some suspensions because you have Doug Pederson giving them an edge over most of the rest of the NFL with his decision making. You could call it play calling, you could call it personnel usage, you could call it the position you put the players in, whether it's a read option and RPO. We hear this terminology over and over again. Going for it on fourth down. There's still many coaches across the NFL who are going to shrug that kind of thing off and just not buy into really the numbers, the probabilities. He is doing things that give them an edge every single week. And you can be a step behind a team in terms of talent and still win games because you're just playing smarter. And right now, until the rest of the league catches up, the Eagles are probably in the top 5, maybe the top 7 in terms of having that edge. And that's not going to change going forward. I don't think. I don't see why anything would change. He's going to keep going for it on fourth and designing these plays that maximize production. So, yeah, they absolutely, call it whatever you want, they absolutely have an edge because of Doug Pederson.
Like he said, whatever you call it, playmaking, decision-making, management style, you can call it whatever you want. But at the end of the day, coaches do make a difference many times in sports because when the coach puts the players in a position to be successful, it allows the players to maximize what they do. You look at players with or without certain coaches, their ability to be successful. In football, Matt Ryan, very successful, very good quarterback under Kyle Shanahan. Without him, he's not the same player. In hockey, everywhere Scotty Bowman ever coached, whether it was the Red Wings, the Penguins, whoever, they all were winning franchises. And there's a reason for that because coaching can change a culture and set a standard of excellence that can be reached to. So that's why when I look at a guy like Herm Edwards, I can see where he's taking that program. When I see a guy like Doug Pederson, I see where he is coming from and the mentality that he is bringing to an organization. I'm not saying that every great coach is going to win all the time, but what I'm saying is that the coach can make a difference because leadership and success is a from the top down mentality, not a bottom up. I'm not a believer in managing up because when you manage up, what you're doing is you're taking responsibility away from the people at the upper levels of an organization. And as a result, there's always going to be a disconnect. Leadership makes a difference. The person who is managing a situation makes a difference. You have to value the role of the head of an organization above anything else because they set the standard for the entire team, for the entire organization moving forward. And that's what differentiates guys like Doug Pederson and Herm Edwards from many of the other coaches in their profession. Topic number 2 in this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Some big news came down on September 12th. The reports from The Hollywood Reporter is that Henry Cavill is out as Superman, and there's really no confirmation of the exact reason why. There's been suggestions there were scheduling conflicts. There's been some suggestion that there was a contract negotiation issue between Warner Brothers and Henry Cavill's representation. But at the end of the day, it looks like we will no longer have Henry Cavill or Ben Affleck in their previous roles as Superman and Batman moving forward. I would argue that Henry Cavill has been the best person to portray Superman since Christopher Reeve did. And that's not a backslap to Tom Welling, what he did with Smallville, which was a very different version of Superman, or anybody else who has portrayed the Man of Steel, whether it's on TV or television, in the last couple decades. But Henry Cavill looked the part. He had a presence on the screen. He felt like Superman. But the problem is that Warner Brothers is trying to take all their movies in a different direction. The darker, more gritty concept of their films just did not resonate anymore. And it looks like it's about time for them to try to go in a different direction. That's why Aquaman has a different feel to it. That's why Shazam looks to be more fun and friendly. Why Wonder Woman is moving her universe ahead several decades. First Wonder Woman movie was set during World War I, the 19-teens, around like 1917. The second Wonder Woman movie is set in 1984, so you're talking about a 70-year gap. Well, there's going to be a lot of reasons for that are going to come out when that movie is released. DC tried to do things fast, loose, and quick. The movie Batman v Superman in 2016 and then the Justice League movie in 2017 did not make good money at all. The studio is hoping that both of those movies could be to them what the Avengers were. But since they did it wrong, those movies only grossed $229 million domestically. By comparison, Black Panther made $200 million in its opening weekend. So DC has had to do a lot of introspection and reevaluation of how they want to handle their universe. And I think that the negotiations with Henry Cavill, it just came to a point, it seems, where because they're going in a different direction, they want to handle things differently. And there's a lot of talk they're going to create a Supergirl film and introduce a younger female to the next Justice League. And so you'll have Wonder Woman and Aquaman kind of be more like the elder statesman of the group. And then you could potentially have the Flash, Supergirl, and Cyborg be the younger two. Now, we don't know where Batman fits on all this because they are still going to make The Batman movie that's supposed to be coming out. But the beauty is that, remember, the original reports for the next Flash movie, which is scheduled for 2020, the theory behind it was that movie, they could use the Flashpoint storyline to help do a soft reset of their universe. So if they did cast a new Batman and a Supergirl, that it would be explained away by, well, because the Flash went in the past, it changed things in the present. And among those things could be Batman, new actor, and Supergirl replacing Superman on the Justice League team. DC went all in with the concept of building around the big three of their comic book universe. Detective Comics, in its original origin before it became known as DC, was always built differently than Marvel. Marvel's comic book universe was always built on character development and having characters that the reader can identify with. DC was not always written that way. DC in many ways was written so their characters were more on a pedestal, that their characters were more of something you looked up to, you were inspired by, not that you could identify with. You know, there's a reason why Peter Parker was originally written as a teenager. There's a reason why the Fantastic Four were a family. It wasn't just four random people. There's a reason why originally when Thor was written, it was Donald Blake picking up Mjolnir and then he would turn into Thor. There's a reason why mutants were written the way they were, because the idea was that these were all people who could be you or me. If we got bit by a radioactive spider, if we got hit by massive amounts of cosmic radiation, if we had a mutant X gene. Marvel was always meant to identify something with the reader. Someone like the Punisher, he appealed to another side of us, which was yeah, bad guys are bad and they should be killed. Or should they be killed? That's an interesting question to have. Marvel always dug deep into things about good and evil, about things that really were graspable concepts. And that's why it was always set in the real world. The only thing in Marvel that's really a fake place, well, actually, there's two of them. There's Wakanda, which is where Black Panther is from in Africa. And then you also have Mandrapore, which is a fictional island supposed to be located in Southeast Asia, which is where a lot of villains and illegal operations happen. So Marvel, for the most part, has always been set in a form of reality to identify with the reader. DC Comics was never meant to be like that. DC Comics, a lot of their characters are larger than life, and that's why they have their big three. You're not going to be Wonder Woman because she's an Amazon and she's from Themyscira and she's the daughter of a goddess and she has the blood of a god in her veins. You know, you can't be Superman because he's from another planet. He's an alien. And it's pretty unlikely that you can be Batman because you're not a billionaire. You're not an orphan. You don't have a British butler who takes care of your every need. You're probably not going to be the Flash because the amount of chemicals and the lightning at the same time that hit him was such a odd occurrence. Aquaman is half man, half Atlantean. You get the idea. You can't be these other characters. So in DC Comics, this is something to look up to aspire to. These characters are larger than life. So what DC tried to do with their movies is they tried to capture those larger than life characters on the big screen. And I think at first that they were successful because I thought Man of Steel was very well done. Some people were very critical of the fight scene between General Zod and the Superman, but at the end of the day, the movie as a whole was actually very, very well done. The acting was great. The origin story was told very well, a very unique fashion, and it set a very good groundwork for what DC wanted to do with their movies. But Batman v Superman was not done very well. It was rushed at times. It did not have a very smooth moving storyline. And then Wonder Woman came along and it kind of picked up the pace. Everyone accepted Wonder Woman. It was a great movie, very well done. Gal Gadot captured the imagination of the character and what she was meant to be. But then Justice League fell right back flat on its face due to choppy writing, due to the fact that you had two different directors who ended up in the end directing the movie and chopping it up and reshooting it multiple times. It was just a mess. Also, in the middle of all this, you have a movie like Suicide Squad, which totally did not do as well as people thought it would because, again, it was not entertaining like Marvel movies are. So DC is trying to recapture that entertainment value. So whereas Aquaman looks like it's going to be visually stunning and impressive, Shazam looks like it's supposed to be fun and interesting. Wonder Woman 1984 is going to try to capitalize on the first Wonder Woman movie, and then The Flash and try to reset the rest of their universe with its movie playing around with time travel. I don't know if this is going to solve all of DC's problems. I know they're also working on the movie Birds of Prey, which is basically going to be a all-female hero/anti-hero group that is going to have Harley Quinn and Black Canary and the Huntress trying to save a young girl from a villain mastermind, which is rumored to be Black Mask. These are all very different movies. These are all very different concepts that DC is playing around with. And different can be good. The problem for DC was they didn't really have an endgame. Now I think you can have an endgame. You can do things a little differently. I think one of the ways you can do things differently is don't be so focused on getting the biggest name on the screen in the biggest way. You got to get back to story writing because what made Batman comics so popular is how the story is written. What makes Superman and these other characters compelling in the comics is how they are written. So if the movies are written better, DC will have more success. With or without Henry Cavill, you know, DC can say all they want. Oh, well, Superman's like James Bond. You know, people come and go in that role. Look, you can cop out however you want. You can try to explain away however you want. But the truth is, DC messed up their own opportunity. And in the end, they shot themselves in the foot. Marvel has movies planned every stage of every level along the way. DC wasn't doing that. DC was kind of flying in some ways by the seat of their pants and just trying to cash in on the superhero hype. And again, what makes the comics different than those movies, what makes the TV shows, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well on the CW with the Arrowverse, different than the movies, is the storytelling. If DC can get the storytelling right, it doesn't matter who is wearing what costume, as long as the actors can own and portray the character properly on screen and the story is well done, that combination will help DC make the money that it wants to off of their characters.
I got into a conversation recently on Twitter with someone about, who is an MMA legend, who are MMA pioneers, and it started with a conversation was being had about Gina Carano. Gina Carano, for those who may not remember her, she was a women's mixed martial arts fighter who was the face of Elite XC and then joined Strikeforce as part of their merger with Elite XC back in the late 2000s. And she was more so well known for her being very attractive than she would for her martial arts skill set, to the point that Elite XC and Strikeforce purposely set her up against easier opponents to help inflate her record moving forward. So when she did have a super fight versus Christine Santos, also known as Chris Cyborg, that even when Carano lost, it would be considered, okay, well, it's only her one loss. Well, Carano used mixed martial arts as a way to launch her acting career, which she has been semi-successful with. Meanwhile, Cyborg has gone on to become one of the most dominant female fighters in women's MMA history. And it was suggested to me that Gina Carano was a pioneer, which she absolutely isn't. Gina Carano was the face of an organization that was attempting to gain more viewers because they did not have the talent on par with the UFC. With the fall of Pride back in 2005 and 2006, there was a major void left open in the martial arts world for a competing martial art promotion to go up against the UFC. And as a result, there came to the forefront 4 organizations that attempted to want to take the number 2 spot that was vacated by the absence of Pride. One of them was Elite XC, and Elite XC's main attraction at the time was Gina Carano and Kimbo Slice. Kimbo Slice, a former online street fighter that went viral, that they got into their organization. They tried to present him as the next big thing in MMA. Well, he got beat easily by Seth Petrozelli, a longtime MMA journeyman. Meanwhile, Gina was fighting a lot of women who were either well past their prime or they were women who were fighting way above their weight class. Gina fought at 145, whereas many of the women who were fighting her were either 135 or 125 fighters by trade. And then you had Strikeforce. Strikeforce was originally established as to be a kickboxing-only organization, later developed in an MMA organization out of San Jose. They would absorb Elite XC's roster later on, and their idea was to try to model themselves after Pride in Japan more so than the UFC. So they tried to do a lot more with presentation, a lot more with colors, schemes, and be a little bit closer to professional wrestling than the UFC was at the time. You also had Bellator MMA, which was still a very young, fledgling organization in the late 2000s. Bellator was kind of the place to go where people couldn't break into the UFC, whereas Elite XC and Strikeforce were kind of the organizations where people went if they either had already left the UFC or they had a contract dispute with the UFC or they were leftovers from Pride. And then you had World Extreme Cage Fighting, which was kind of the home for the lighter weight classes more so. They had heavier weight classes for a long time, but when Zuffa bought them out, they realized the value of the 145, 135 fighters on the roster. They kept those weight classes open while closing the heavier weight classes and allowed the development of them so eventually UFC could absorb WEC's roster into their own. And so Gina was the byproduct of an organization trying to fill a void with this very attractive woman. to be a fighter. That in no way makes her a pioneer. That in no way makes her a legend or a Hall of Famer in MMA terms. It just means that she was there at the beginning. No one stands up and says, well, the reason why Christy Mathewson is in the Baseball Hall of Fame, or the reason why Lance Allworth is in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, or why George Mikan is in the Hall of Fame, isn't because they just happened to be there at the beginning of their sports history. It was because of the fact that they were great players in their own right. MMA is a different judge than the team sports, and the box office attraction is not the same as best MMA fighter. If you go over the last 30 years, the best MMA fighters in the sport are guys like Anderson Silva and Dan Henderson and BJ Penn and Matt Hughes, George St. Pierre. These were the guys who were the great fighters. But who were the top box office attractions? It was Brock Lesnar. Now it's Conor McGregor. It was Ronda Rousey. The only one of those who's going to go down as one of the greatest fighters is Ronda. Because Ronda was the real pioneer. Ronda was the reason why women's MMA went from being a niche to going mainstream with the UFC. Because she had box office appeal. Because she showed that you can be a great MMA fighter and draw as well. You know, the UFC, before Brock Lesnar came along, they built up a lot of their own fighters and their reputations and their fights. They put them on a pedestal that said, this is the greatest fighter on earth. So every champion was the best guy at his weight class, if you believe the UFC. So when Chuck Liddell was champion of 205, when Randy Couture was the champion at heavyweight, or when Rich Franklin was the champion at middleweight, they were the best fighter on the planet at their weight class. But when Brock Lesnar came along, it changed the dynamic of promotions for the UFC, because the UFC started focusing more on star power within the athlete instead of promoting the athlete as much. They would kind of ride the wave. And it was very convenient at the time that Anderson Silva was the middleweight champion, because you didn't really have to sell him that hard. The guy was undefeated at the time in the UFC. He was just beating everybody he came across. It was an easy sell. BJ Penn returned as a legend. That was an easy sell. Dan Henderson knocks out Michael Bisping. That was an easy sell. But when Brock Lesnar left, when the UFC lightweight championship ended up in the hands of Frankie Edgar, when they brought in the lighter weight classes of 145 and 135, the UFC had strayed so far away from the model that made them who they were for the 10 years prior to Brock Lesnar coming along and taking the sport by storm, that the box office attraction became the hyper-central focus of each pay-per-view card. The idea was that instead of putting the best fights on each and every card, it was to make sure that at the top of the card was a main attraction to sell pay-per-views and tickets. Now in today's world, where's the hyper-focus on? It's on Conor McGregor. It's on Brock Lesnar still after all this time. It's on the situation around John Jones being suspended by the USADA. Chael Sonnen became a megastar in the sport, and he never won a championship. It's because he talked a great game, and fans were drawn to that. Donald Cowboy Cerrone, another guy who's never won a UFC championship. But yeah, he's very popular because of his attitude, because he is a guy who appeals to the fan base. You have a guy like Demetrius Johnson, a longtime UFC flyweight champion, doesn't get publicized as much as Cerrone, Edgar, Aldo, and these other fighters who only are about 10, 20, 30 pounds heavier than he is in weight class. Without Anderson Silva in the middleweight division, without Chris Weidman in the middleweight division, it's in flux. Now you have Robert Whittaker with the belt. Before that, it was Michael Bisping. Before that, it was Chris Weidman. There has been a consistent champion at 185. There's been flux at light heavyweight because of John Jones being suspended, Daniel Cormier being able to beat everybody but John Jones. And then what happens? Daniel Cormier moves up to heavyweight, beats Stipe Miocic, the longest reigning UFC heavyweight champion. He becomes a 2-division champion. So what does the UFC do? They latch now on the Daniel Cormier. Instead of promoting everybody on the roster, they're only promoting the top tier guys on the roster. And that is causing such a hyper focus to be on what name and what fights are going to sell us the most tickets and the most pay-per-views, instead of saying we're going to promote these guys so much that we're going to elevate their name so that everybody will want to buy these guys. Instead of doing that, they're latching on the names who are already there. Instead of developing stars, they're waiting for stars to come to them. And that's why it's so easy to look back at Gina Carano and say, oh, she had to be one of the pioneers of women's MMA, which is not true. Women like Tara LaRose, Misha Tate, Sarah Kaufman, Marloes Conan, Julia Kedzie, these are women who were fighting long before Ronda Rousey ever came along. They're the one who set the foundation for when Ronda became who Ronda was, that there was somebody there for Ronda to even fight, that there was a women's 135 division, a women's 145, and women fighting in multiple weight classes that allowed for the expansion that we see today. Now in the UFC, you have a 145-pound champion for women, a 135-pound, 125, and 115-pound women's champion. That wouldn't be there, not because of Gina Carano. She just happened to be a pretty face for an organization that was owned by a television company that was trying to get viewers. Now, it's the other women that set the precedent for women's MMA. So do not mix up Conor McGregor being one of the biggest sellers of tickets and pay-per-views in the UFC with him being one of the greatest fighters of all time, because Conor still has a long ways to go to prove that he belongs in the greatest of all time discussion. Brock Lesnar is not one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time. He may have been a dominant force of nature as a heavyweight for a short time period, but he's not even one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. He's definitely not in the top 5 at least. He may be in the top 10, but that's because the sport of MMA is still very young. Remember, MMA as we know it today has only been around since the early 90s. And then the unified rules of mixed martial arts and its universal application didn't really come into play until the early 2000s. So you're talking about a sports history that is still only 20 to 30 years old. So when we talk about the greatest of all time, 50 years from now, we're going to have a very different conversation about these fighters because of the fact that the sport will have evolved and grown so much from what it was 10 years ago in 2008 to what it could be in 2058, that Gina Carano is going to be basically a footnote in history, whereas other fighters are going to be much more well known as the legends to lay the foundation for what the sport is today. So more information about this season's Arrowverse Crossover. The crossover events have become a very popular thing for the CW shows. It has given them an opportunity to see interaction between The Flash, Arrow, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow, and it has allowed them to expand on different story arcs and different information about each hero. Well, this year's crossover has two purposes. One is going to introduce to the CW universe the character of Batwoman, which is going to get her own show. Also, it is going to allow more exploration into a part of the Arrowverse that really has not been touched on yet, and that is the world outside of the cities their superheroes typically exist in. Remember, the Arrow primarily stays within Star City. The Flash generally stays in Center City. Supergirl stays mostly in National City. She doesn't really travel too much. We hear about Metropolis, but we don't really see it that much. And then DC Legends of Tomorrow, if they do go to a city, it's almost always Star City. They almost never go to any other towns unless they're time traveling. So traditionally, we haven't seen much outside of the home bases of said superheroes. We're going to now see an exploration in the Gotham. And I think that what we're going to see is that this series is going to take place not on Earth 1, but on Earth 38, which is the Earth that Supergirl exists on in the CW universe. And that's going to be that way probably for two reasons. One, because it's going to be very hard to explain a Batwoman and a Gotham in Earth 1, considering that we've already been told that in Earth 1 that there is a Bruce Wayne that exists in Earth 1, and that there is a vigilante in Bloodhaven, which Bloodhaven is the main city of Nightwing. So it would be hard to explain why there would be a Batwoman in Earth 1, but it makes more sense for her to be in Earth 38 because Gotham is something that has not been explored or mentioned much in Earth 38. Also, there's been inferences of other vigilantes around the earth. Also coming up in this year's crossover, we're going to meet Lois Lane of the Arrowverse, and also Superman will have a main role in the crossover event as well. Interestingly enough, they're going to do a 3-night crossover and not a 4-night crossover, unlike at times in the past. It's going to start with The Flash, followed by Arrow, and followed by Supergirl. Very different setup. Supergirl is going to be on Sunday nights this year, but instead she's going to move to a night later in the week for the crossover. And I think this is going to be also interesting because there's no legends involved, which tells me that they're going to try to do their best to separate the legends from depending on the other shows to support it. Because as I mentioned in a previous podcast, these shows are going to have different time slots now moving forward. So that's going to be another interesting twist involved in all of this. So now with different time slots from a majority of these shows, as well as a distinction between Legends of Tomorrow and the rest of the shows, is going to allow them to focus more on John Constantine and what they're doing with Legends of Tomorrow instead of introducing him and the element of that show into this crossover. Also, the expectation of the show is going to get into the backstory a little bit of how Batwoman became the superhero of Gotham City, a world where there's not a Batman, but there is a Batwoman. I think it's a very unique dynamic that we haven't seen before. You're introducing Kate Kane to a universe where you have established female superheroes already, and it's going to allow them to do more with her character moving forward. So there's a lot of elements that are coming to the Arrowverse. The biggest thing I'm interested in seeing with this crossover is, how does Oliver get out of prison? I've mentioned this in a previous podcast. You know, he's going to start the Arrow season in prison. So how is the Arrow going to have a crossover event if he's still in jail? You know, now you do have 2 months to get him out of jail, but I think that when he gets out of jail, I don't think it's going to be by the traditional sense. Stephen Amell has said in interviews that he wants them to treat this season of Arrow like it could be their last. So if that's how they're going to treat it, I think it's only fair to give the fans everything they possibly can for the crossover as well as this season of Arrow. And somehow you're going to see Oliver Queen not in prison anymore. And you're going to see him interact with Batwoman. You're going to see him interact with Superman. A lot of variables are going to go into in leading up to this crossover. And I think as the new seasons of The Flash, Supergirl, and Arrow debut in October, there's going to be a lot more clarity about why there has to be a crossover. Remember, in the past, crossover events usually had a centralized theme or story or villain. So, for example, the one crossover was about an invasion. The other crossover was about fighting Vandal Savage. Usually when there's a crossover event, it's about a major situation they're dealing with. You know, last season, this crossover was the Earth X, the alternate universe where all the heroes were villains and the villains were heroes. They kind of had reverse roles. I'm interested to see if this is going to be located on Supergirl's Earth. Who exactly is going to be the primary villain? I think that's going to have a lot to do with how those shows build up to that crossover.
Topic number 5 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I want to touch on a topic that gets really misconstrued coverage, and a lot of misinformation is out there when it comes to not just the NFL, but the game of football. There's been a lot of misinformation out there about the popularity of the game of football. There's been a lot of insinuation that because the NFL's ratings have taken a decline, that there are less people watching football today. And I'm here to explain to you that a lot of the insinuation from members of the news media, from people at different networks, from different politicians, it's all false. I was reminded again of this recently. The top 5 television shows from Monday, September 3rd, which was Labor Day, to Sunday, September 9th, they were all NFL games. That's right. The most watched game was actually not even the best game of the weekend. 23.3 million viewers watched Cowboys versus Panthers, a game that for all intents and purposes was a defensive battle and not that exciting. Second most watched game, 22.1 million watched, Bears versus Packers. Aaron Rodgers on basically one leg, carrying his team back to victory. Thursday football, Eagles game, opening night, 19 million viewers. Texans versus Patriots, 17.1 million viewers. 49ers versus Vikings, 12.5 million viewers. On top of all that, for the previous week, 3 of the top 5 television shows were college football games. Among them, Sunday, September 2nd, the LSU versus Miami game. So where is the decline in football's popularity? Go back to last year. The most watched sporting events in 2017 was not the NBA. It was not Major League Baseball. The top 12 most watched sporting events in the year of 2017 were all football games. In fact, for Super Bowl 51, 111.32 million people watched just that game. I said football, by the way, because the College Football National Championship of 2017 itself had 14.2 million viewers. The viewership for football is still at an extremely high level compared to anything else on television. So why do people keep saying that football is on the decline? Why do people keep saying that football is on a downward slope? Because it fits an agenda. You see, on one hand, the NFL, because of the president and because of Colin Kaepernick and because of people with agendas, the NFL and football as a whole has become a political pawn, just like many other topics in this world, like taxes and civil rights and abortion have become very inflammatory topics to be used in political and news talk. So has now the NFL and football as a whole as a game. But the other reason why this is the topic that's brought up very often is because people want to ignore the real reason for the ratings decline. The real reason there's a ratings decline has nothing to do with people's love or hate of football. It has to do with the reality that fewer and fewer people are watching TV in the traditional sense. The number of people in today's world who are watching sports, their favorite television shows, and their movies no longer on the cable networks, no longer on their dish networks. They're getting it through their internet. They watch it on their phone. They watch it on PlayStation View, YouTube TV. They got Roku. They got Hulu. They got Netflix. There's a plethora of options that have nothing to do with signing up for your local cable or satellite provider in order to watch TV. So when you see, for example, last year when they were saying, well, ratings for week 4 of the NFL season were overall down 21%, but actually all television viewership is down 20 to 30%, because that 20 to 30% are not watching the games anymore. Those people, they're not watching it on cable television because the rating services draw their information from the cable and satellite providers. The NFL does not release the viewership numbers for their red zone channels. If you have Comcast or if you have DirecTV, you can purchase a sports package along with the NFL Network to get Red Zone, which allows you to see every score from every game every week of the NFL regular season. The NFL does not release the ratings for that channel. But we know for a fact that there are a lot of people who watch it, because when Scott Hansen over the last several years has done charitable fundraisers through his viewership, it is incredible the outpouring of the hundreds of thousands, close to millions of people who are just getting involved in Twitter campaigns, submitting just $1 to raise money for charity. Which doesn't include all the people who had nothing to do with the campaign, who didn't even see the promotion, who didn't want to get involved in promotion or didn't have the money to get involved in any charitable promotion. The NFL also does not always hand out to Nielsen their numbers for the people who are watching the games on NFL media platforms. For example, the first official Thursday football game of the season is only on NFL Network. You can watch it on your phone through the NFL app. You can also watch it through Yahoo Sports streaming platform, but is not available on CBS, ABC, NBC, or Fox. So what happens? The NFL then will release the next day all the viewership numbers that they tracked themselves, because they don't want to give Nielsen or any ratings outlet that tracks viewership the press release over them, because the NFL wants to control the release of information about their own league. The NBA does something similar, but they're not as nefarious about it. But for all the people who always say, well, the NBA, they're on the come up. They're coming for the NFL. Cavs-Warriors games are capping off in the last few years between 20 and 25 million people. The College Football National Championship game had 25.27 million viewers. Even college football is more popular than the NBA still. Football is not losing popularity, but fewer and fewer people are watching the game on their cable or satellite subscription. It's a huge difference. So don't get it twisted. The ratings decline has nothing to do with people actually not watching or being interested in football. It's because fewer and fewer people are signed up to watch their sports and their movies and their TV shows through cable or satellite. More and more, when you go into major cities like New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and Los Angeles and Dallas and Houston and Miami and other major cities, because the infrastructure and the internet access is so readily available in those major cities and their suburban regions that surround them, more and more people are deciding not to stick with the cables and the dishes. That's the real reason why the ratings decline. You think fewer people are watching TV shows because the ratings declines? Look across the board. Television ratings are down. Why? Because Nielsen is tracking it through cable and dish. They don't have access to the digital numbers at all times. It's not readily available to them. Furthermore, on the DraftKings Sportsbook app, there's already been placed 1.5 million bets since the DraftKings Sportsbook app came online in early August. So you're talking about a month and a couple weeks that the DraftKings Sportsbook is only in New Jersey. It's only can be used in the state of New Jersey, not Pennsylvania, not New York, because they do not have legalized sports betting yet. Since the start of the football season, the number of bets placed has doubled. There has been a rapid increase of betting just for college and the NFL. Way more than baseball. Way more than any other sport. In fact, more people in Vegas each year bet on college football and the NFL than baseball, hockey, and soccer combined on a yearly basis. Please again explain to me how football is losing popularity. I would argue it's just gaining popularity because of the fact that there are more ways to engage the sports fan than ever before.
Topic number 6 in this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So news came out this month about who are going to be some of the characters who are going to appear in the second Spider-Man film starring Tom Holland as this iteration of Peter Parker. The movie Spider-Man Far From Home, reports are it's going to be set in Europe. That's why it's going to be Far From Home. And that Peter Parker is going to be sharing time this time around, not with Tony Stark, but with Nick Fury and with Maria Hill. We saw them have major cameo appearance at the end of Avengers Infinity War. We know that Samuel L. Jackson is going to have a major part in the upcoming Captain Marvel film, and now it looks like he's going to have a serious role in Spider-Man Far From Home. And the reason this is significant is because this is a sign to everybody about the evolution and the development of Marvel Cinematic Universe post Avengers 4. Because remember, with actors like Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Hemsworth, all their contracts expiring soon, we have to see a new introduction of who is going to be the main caretakers of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's why there's a Doctor Strange 2 coming out, a Black Panther 2, a Guardians of the Galaxy 3, a Spider-Man 2. Films all coming along. And now with the purchase of Fox Studios, gaining Marvel back the rights to the X-Men and Fantastic Four characters, a deal that is expected to be completely finalized by 2019, it has come to the forefront that you're going to need somebody else to oversee a lot of these new characters that are going to carry the Marvel Cinematic Universe from Phase 4 to Phase 5. And we expect in Phase 5 is where we will see the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. And who better to do that than the original spy himself, the former head of S.H.I.E.L.D., Nick Fury, played by Samuel L. Jackson. And the fact that he's going to appear and have a serious role in Spider-Man Far From Home instead of Tony Stark tells you that we may see Tony Stark for the last time in Avengers 4, as well as Chris Evans playing Captain America. Because moving forward, your Avengers team is probably going to consist of, after Avengers 4, whenever they do the next Avengers movie, it's going to be Spider-Man, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, Captain Marvel, and then probably Ant-Man and the Wasp. So you're having a totally new cast with the Avengers, and Samuel L. Jackson looks like he's going to be part of the catalyst to move them forward. That also allows them to interweave Captain Marvel into a bigger role in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as well, because of Samuel L. Jackson's major role in the Captain Marvel movie. Samuel L. Jackson playing Nick Fury is a very simple character to keep interweaving with all these characters, because he's the guy who says he has eyes everywhere. He's the ultimate spy. He has knowledge of classified information that nobody else even is fully aware of could even exist. You're talking about a character in Nick Fury who could definitely be a bridge to Phase 5 because of his involvement with Spider-Man and Captain Marvel. And don't be surprised if in some way they take Sebastian Stan's Bucky Barnes and give him a larger role in the MCU moving forward, especially because of the fact Sebastian Stan has a few movies left on his contract. So I wouldn't be surprised if he appears in not just the next Black Panther movie, but in several movies beyond that, and him possibly taking on the mantle of Captain America, with Steve Rogers either being killed in the Avengers 4 movie or Chris Evans just retiring and walking off into the sunset. So there's a lot of transitions to be going on in Phase 4, because you've got 10 years with a whole cast of characters who are going to be, in some way, shall I call it, retired. So you have a whole new set of characters moving along, and it looks like Samuel L. Jackson's Nick Fury character is going to be a big catalyst in Phase 4, starting with Captain Marvel and with Spider-Man Far From Home. I wouldn't be surprised if he also appears in a couple more movies, including the Black Widow movie starring Scarlett Johansson, and possibly even the Black Panther 2 movie. Thanks for listening to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. If you have some thoughts on topics we discussed today, why don't you drop your thoughts in the comments section below. If you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe so you catch the episodes as we bring them to you each week. And remember, this is your home to get a unique perspective on the hot topics in the sports and the comic book, television, and movie worlds. I'm Josh Hennig, your host. Catch you next time.